I am an architect and postdoc researcher at the University of Cagliari. The title of the research is Brocchetto and Eternit, a building style for Sardinian spontaneous modernity. So this research, which is still in its initial phase, I was saying, tackles the subject of building informality in the context of Sardinia, addressing the so-called non finito. It's a series of building practices specific to private houses, widely diffused in the southern regions of Italy, that entail the use of modern building materials, such as concrete blocks, metal plates, and beton brut, without finishing plasters or claddings. The non finito characterizes the urban landscape to the point of representing a catastrophe, according to the critics of the phenomenon, hampering the preservation of historical milieu and traditional building techniques. Although the phenomenon does not necessarily imply defiance of building laws, it is often associated with the widespread practices of illicit construction known as abusivism. The aim of the research is thus to highlight the relationship between the practices of the non finito and the deontic realm, focusing in particular on two aspects. The first is its relationship with the social norms of the territories, urban or rural, in which it proliferates. Is it accepted? Is it considered positively or negatively? The second aspect consists in reconsidering, in light of the findings, here it is, the instruments used by the public decision maker to tackle it derive from the negative perception of the phenomenon both in scholarly and general debate. Which instruments are employed, with which costs, and with which results? While a wide array of researchers has openly addressed the problem of abusivism in Italy, an attempt to frame morphological and aesthetic issues in light of social norms of the non finito phenomenon is still lacking. The term non finito is commonly used in modern art criticism to describe a series of unfinished pieces of art. In particular, it's typically used to refer to Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Auguste Rodin in finished sculptures and paintings that share the intentionality of incompleteness. According to art critics, the non finito implied a display of a frustration for the lack of a technical means to fulfill the artist's magnificent conceptions, mistakes in the procedure or defects in the marble block that hampered the success of the operation, a procedure of self-critique, or on the contrary, the fulfillment of a spiritual condition of detachment that recognizes in the non finito the expressive and dramatic vitality that the artist was seeking. The same term is used in the general discourse to refer to the practice of leaving a building in a state of incompleteness, typical of the south of Italy, and at the center of this brief investigation of Sardinia. Although generally overlooked in scholarly debate, the non finito edile, as it is called, is ubiquitous in Sardinia, to the point of characterizing smaller towns as a building culture per se, entailing a deep relation between the practices of building and inhabiting and the formal, material, productive, and economic models of local societies. The Sardinian non finito is predominant in private houses, where the owners have a certain immediacy of action, and characterizes particularly urban fronts and public spaces of small villages. In bigger cities, the non finito seems to be discouraged by a stricter control by public authorities and by the denser settlement pattern, which makes unlikely a spontaneous modification of the building by the owners of the single apartments. In this essay, I will firstly display the grammar and syntax of the non finito. For grammar, I refer to the basic materials of construction of which the non finito is made, while the syntax is here intended as the practices of building with such materials, the principle of composition, and the aggregation that are peculiar to this building style, often beyond the intended scope of the material itself. Secondly, I will discuss the normative framework of the non finito. While a wider, more analytic research carried on by means of interviews and surveys seems to be needed to address the social norms underlying the practices of the non finito, I will summarize the readings of the phenomenon in literature, in particular anthropology, offering a series of original interpretations on which a following study can further expand, outlining the prescriptive dimension of these researches. I will then illustrate recent policies enacted by local authorities to contrast the phenomenon that act on the same wavelength of the previous readings. As with its artistic counterpart, the concept of non finito presupposes the interruption of a process of creation that leaves the artifact in a state of incompleteness. While this is true for a series of elements proper of the non finito, notably the absence of plasters, this is not the common trait shared by its constitutive elements. Its grammar is composed of a wide array of building materials that share only one attribute. They have all originated in the 20th century. The first building elements are breeze blocks. They are generally medium-sized, approximately 20 per 20 per 40 centimeters, and are the ubiquitous sign of the non finito building style. Their use has originated during the 40s, when they were made in situ, to be promptly replaced by prefabricated hollow blocks in the following decade. Their shape and dimension correspond roughly to the stone blocks used in a series of traditional building cultures. In Sardinian vernacular, these bricks blocks are commonly called brocchetti, from the adaptation of the Italian for small blocks. Another distinctive trait of the non-finito masonry are brick blocks. They manifest themselves in manifold shapes and dimensions. Their use has become frequent at the turn of the last century, when the consolidation of the industrial processes made them convenient and more practical due to their lightweight compared to the heavy concrete blocks. Their availability in different forms and dimensions makes their presence indicative of the non-finito. In situ cast concrete, whether reinforced or not, shown without any embarrassment, is another distinctive trait of the non-finito language, differently from brutalism, which, according to Allison and Peter Smithson, sought to consciously face up to a mass production society and drag a rough poetry out of the confused and powerful forces which are at work. The non-finito displays the rough technical fact without any intent but to build. Beton brew is thus extremely frequent within the domino schemes in columns and slabs. Although elements of an unwilling or inadvertent expressionism can be often found in anonymous buildings that refer to wider stylistic currents, such as arches, or expressionist corbels, reminiscent of Japanese brutalism. A trait inherent in the use of in situ cast concrete is the presence of rebars projecting out of the concrete mass that suggests a further completion of the building, which are commonly addressed to as irons of hope, suggesting that their presence is due to a hope to finish the building. The last element characterizing the non-finito are the many kinds of roofing sheets, the most common being called Eternit, from the commercial name of a fiber cement undulated sheet enriched with asbestos, which has been proven the cause of a great number of malignant mesotheliomas. The product was banned from most European countries in the early 90s. Despite that, the material was so widespread that it is now extremely common, especially in rural buildings. Eternit roofings are a constant presence in Sardinia. So alongside these minimal constituents of the non-finito that I have defined the grammar lies the syntax of the building culture. With this term, I refer to two distinct traits. The first is the use of the single material elements. In particular, often these elements are improperly employed with creative solutions that, despite their peculiar use, are nonetheless widespread. The second part of the syntax consists in its relation with the previous building cultures and its historical layering. Traditional materials are usually not replaced by modern materials, but their interaction is stratified and complex. As seen before, breeze blocks are usually used mainly for masonry works. Their success can be explained in terms of versatility and affordability. Their use is nonetheless not limited to the construction of walls, but we may say they are kind of wild card of the non-finito. They are suitable for an impromptu flight of steps. They can be successfully employed for a cheap and strong column, for a lightweight Eternit canopy in the backyard. Breeze blocks can also play an aesthetic role if colored and sustain a fence and a gate. We can say that they are used as a massing tool for any purpose, especially in rural contexts. Although the use of brick blocks is not limited to masonry, they display a certain degree of versatility. Within the same attitude of massing, it happens that brickworks are often used improperly in respect to their intended use. For instance, in this house, the gaps left by windows jambs are filled with smaller bricks untoothed, and the upper row of the masonry is fitted with smaller hollow bricks whose hole pass through the wall incredibly. While shift from traditional building cultures to modern materials represent a crisis in the production and supply system and in the practice of organization of the built environment, the two syntactic traits interact, the historical and the creative uses, at the same time displaying a series of continuities, where the ancient techniques of tradition coexisted with the new technologies. Rather than replace them, their use got grafted into traditional building manufacture. An extremely interesting phenomenon regards houses built with the traditional technique of adobe, which consists of bricks made of raw earth enriched with plant fibers. During a time span that lasted approximately 10 years, at the turn of 1940, in the southern parts of Sardinia, a good number of these houses' slabs were built with the use of the groundbreaking technology of reinforced concrete in lieu of the traditional wooden structure. Modern materials, from a point of view of the expert knowledge required to build a city, did not represent a disruptive phenomenon. Builders adapted their understanding of the craftsmanship, simply switching from, for instance, stones to bricks or raw earth to brick blocks. So for a rather long period, the two building cultures coexisted and hybridated significantly, producing an experimentation still readable in Sardinian urban and rural landscape. Rather than palimpsest, the non finito falls within the idea of messy landscape. There is no erasing and rewriting, but rather signs are brought together messily and without a clearly legible hierarchy among the new and traditional elements. This idea partially contradicts the previous claim for existence of a strong continuity in craftsmanship know-how, but this mess is the result of the historical building culture, which, rather than adapting to the new materials and techniques, fills its holes with them. While the framework discussed is now predominantly descriptive, in approaching the prescriptive aspects of the non finito, it is essential to distinguish between two dimensions. The first regards the perception of the phenomenon with respect to social norms. The second regards the institutional perception of the phenomenon. Although more extensive and more recent studies on the perception of the non finito by the inhabitants have not yet been produced, a series of signs indicates a general aversion to the phenomenon by the elites. The only consistent scholarly readings of the non finito are the works of the anthropologist Giulio Angioni. For Angioni, in Sardinian housing culture, what is more appreciated is, above all, the quantity of the house. Even when a significant part remains unused in everyday life, the traditional house for Angioni is never finished, but conceived to be extended as much as possible. In his understanding, the non finito represents the modern legacy of the pre-modern rural mode of production, in which the element of distinction of the dominant classes was embodied in the dimension of the house. A nice house is first and foremost a big house. Reflecting on the modern transition, Angioni asserts that everything that comes from the tradition was rejected, but the aspiration for a house as big as possible, even if this means leaving it unfinished. He compares the manifestation of the phenomenon to a bold young man fully dressed with tie and stiff collar, possibly with an expensive hat and barefoot. Curiously, despite this continuity, which has been highlighted in the previous morphological analysis between the pre-modern building culture and the hybridated, messy building culture that resulted from the introduction of modern materials, the view of Angioni is that of an anthropological catastrophe, which is destined to leave long-lasting marks on the landscape. For Angioni, stone building cultures are aesthetically superior, and the non finito should be erased from the landscape by means of a return to stone. We could and ought invest in stone, he said, maybe helping those who do it, encouraging them with grants and compensations. For Angioni, the non finito stems from an historical condition typical of the social and economical structure of Sardinia, being thus a spontaneous manifestation. This manifestation, for its aesthetic qualities, should be hampered through public spending. Curiously, the image chosen to illustrate the text represents a traditional stone house in the center of Sardinia, not radically different from a house built with brick blocks. The non finito is commonly associated with illicit construction. The non-finisher acts according to its resources and needs, often outside the strict regime of building permits. Moreover, leaving a building unfinished is a way to mitigate potential damages from an order of demolition. But considering as valid the descriptive framework developed by Angioni, it is likely that a non-finito is not perceived problematically by the executor. Despite that, a number of local building regulations issued when the phenomenon was already established implicitly or explicitly address the issue. A series of examples to describe this normative state of facts include, in Teulada, walls projecting on a public space when not built in fair-faced bricks or adobe, carefully profiled, or natural stone, must be covered in plaster and painted accordingly. In Villa Simius, designers must provide perspective views in which stone cladding elements composed by local materials such as granite or natural stone are displayed. Sometimes the reference to the non-finito is more subtle, like in Morgongiori, where walls projecting on a public space must be arranged in such a way that the decorum of the built environment and their harmonic integration in the urban context are assured. Whereas in other cases, the prescriptions are extremely detailed, like in a Basanta, whose local building code prescribes that the facades of the buildings visible from the public spaces must be finished with plaster and painted with colors which must be common and harmonic. Alternatively, they must be realized in local stone with natural split, with mortar bedding executed according to local tradition, a few millimeters set back from the plane of the wall or flush, but not predominant compared to the size of the stone, from which any smudge or stain of mortar should be removed. Local regulations have started tackling the issue in relatively recent times. The example reported were enacted in the last 25 years, while Angioni's research work had taken place during the 70s and the 80s, anticipating the awareness on the issue by the elites responsible for the enactment of the law. Similarly, a series of publicly funded initiatives from regional authorities provides grants up to 60% of the cost of the maintenance and finishings of the building's public facades as a consequence of a law dating 1998. The last of these initiatives was launched in 2019 for a total of 23 million euros. Years later, Angioni's plea for stone buildings has found its application both with prescriptive instruments and with financial incentives, in an effort to purge 4 decades of hybridization of traditional building cultures with modern materials. As a conclusion, the non finito phenomenon in Sardinian context is deeply entrenched in local building practices and culture. Although non finito manifestations are not necessarily executed in violation of building laws and regulations, the act of leaving a building without finishes, be they claddings, plaster, or tilings, is often associated with either non-compliance with local regulation, and it's so in the last 20 years, and the lack of a permit. In addition, the regulative framework, implicit or explicitly, discourages and prohibits manifestations of the non finito, and on the other side, promotes the conversion of the non finito into finished objects with references to pre-modern local building cultures. Negative aspects of these policies range from a misunderstood traditional style built in compliance with building regulations that misrepresents the underlying building cultures, to public spending intended to ameliorate urban landscape that, however, benefits homeowners with little or no advantage for public spaces. The hybridization process described has not yet been an object of studies, and little we know of the qualities of this process. Further research is required to acquire knowledge of the popular conception of the phenomenon, and to elaborate on potential aesthetic and documentary value of the non finito, of its expressive and dramatic vitality, that can, if explored, tell us the history of the most important radical transformation of the built environment. Thank you for listening.